Welcome. This is a masterclass video that we've created for SchemaPlay trainers in June 2021. It's presented by myself, John Siraj-Blatchford, and Lynette Brock. Further details, including the bibliographic references we refer to in the presentation, can be found in associated publications that are posted for download or for purchase on the SchemaPlay website, which is this one, https SchemaPlay.com. Before I get started, I need to say something about copyright. The video includes copyright material that's subject to agreements that we've made with children, parents and practitioners. They feature in a number of sections, so please respect our agreement, and it shouldn't be copied in any form at all, shared or presented to any audience without our explicit agreement. Thank you. Now, further details you can find on the SchemaPlay website, and of course our contact details as well. Ofsted inspections provide a significant context for the consideration of quality, and so we therefore begin with a reference to the September 2021 inspection handbook, which sets out how early years foundation stage providers are to be inspected and how Ofsted make judgments about those inspections. So we're going to look at just the first two areas that are covered in the handbook: overall effectiveness and the quality of education. And the criteria for the judgments that are made by Ofsted are both presented in the inspection framework overview of research and also the research for further education. So I'm going to refer to those explicitly, as of course the handbook does. So if we begin with the 2019 overview of research, the quality of education is defined in terms of 4 grade criteria in 6 dimensions. And the grade criteria are breadth, balance, progression, and expectations, or high expectations. So it sets out that leaders should adopt or construct a curriculum that's ambitious and designed to give learners, particularly the most disadvantaged, the knowledge and cultural capital they need to succeed in life. In terms of balance, learners should study the full curriculum, provided ensuring that the teaching is full a range of subjects as possible, specialising only when necessary. In terms of progression, the provider's curriculum is coherently planned and sequenced towards cumulatively sufficient knowledge and skills for future learning. And in terms of high expectations, the stress is on the ambitions for all learners being equal, except where special educational needs or disabilities are defined, and very ambitious. So those are the 4 grade criteria. The 6 dimensions are, first of all, related to curriculum. So it provides a rationale for the 4 above criteria, and it particularly highlights the problem of low expectations again, and a narrow curriculum that's often provided for disadvantaged children. We'll say something more about that in a moment. It's reinforced by Grenier in development matters, the non-statutory guidance too. The second of the 6 research dimensions is on teacher subject knowledge and support, and it specifically refers to early years. Teachers need to know how children develop and learn and have a clear understanding of possible next steps in their development and teaching, and they're confident in their subject knowledge, recognising learning opportunities in the children's play. That's a very useful statement, I think, for us. Effective teaching, effective pedagogy consists of both teaching and the provision of instructive and stimulating learning environments and routines, and the latter need to be well planned and developed with clear goals on what learning is intended. So again, we've got learning environment as well as the routines, and as in other reviews of research from Ofsted and DFE, the sustained shared thinking is highlighted as well. We'll say more about that later. The next dimension is memory and learning, which is very significant to us because it emphasises the importance of John Sweller's cognitive load theory that's been developed in the last 10 years or so. and it's extremely influential internationally in education. It identifies learning as a change in long-term memory, most significantly. It then emphasises the importance of repetition and curriculum integration for student learning. To quote directly from the Ofsted research review, the long-term memory consists of a range of schemata, which are complex structures that link knowledge and create meaning, and which are built up over time. Experts possess far more detailed and complex schemata than novice learners. So we're on the same page with SchemaPlay, clearly. However, before entering long-term memory and developing schemata, information must first be processed by the short-term or working memory, as this has limited capacity. Retention of knowledge and development of schemata will not happen if the working memory is overloaded. Now that becomes very much the theme of this presentation, as you will see. The other dimensions that the report looks at is assessment, and again the focus is on formative assessment, which will be familiar to everyone from the Development Matters, previous copies of Development Matters. And the Ofsted report makes a particular point that the overall value of assessment should of course not obscure the fact that overuse and questionable practice have emerged as major issues in the English education system and have contributed to overtly high workloads among teachers, overly high workloads. So this is again echoed by Grenier and addressed directly in the development of Development Matters. The other aspect is on reading, which generally is emphasised as the way of children gaining access to schooling more generally. So it's very much a readiness perspective there. The other research document that's quoted in the handbook is related to further education. That's relevant to us because we are talking about the training and CPD focus on practitioners as well. It begins by noting that cognitive load theory is as relevant to further education and skills sector as any other part of the education system, and it stresses the importance of situated and work-based learning and access to theoretical knowledge by practitioners in service. Learners will then be able to go beyond the limits of their particular situation and move towards deeper understanding of the field and more in general. So again, the video is addressing that directly. It also addresses the issue of pedagogical content knowledge, which is referred to in the research as being key area for development across education. So the stress here is on cognitive load, work-based learning, CPD, theoretical knowledge being included in that, and pedagogical content knowledge, which is the stressed area of competence. As I said, Grenier reinforces that focus on the workload, and he refers to the fact that the age bands in the 2012 Development Matters were split into 3 levels, and there's 17 areas of learning with 20 children in a group. You'd end up with 2,040 assessments to consider, which really needed to be sorted out, and therefore he ensured that there was a 20% reduction in that. The question really that we need to address is whether that's enough, 20% reduction in 2,040 assessments. SchemaPlay supports children's learning and development by focusing on just the 23 most foundational schemes and complex operations that children develop in their free flow play. But we then go on to apply in every area of learning and development across the whole curriculum. So very much in common with many other authorities, we're very keen to stop this tracking and tick box work and really focus on the learning journeys that the children are taking instead. So if we consider the actual challenge of the practitioner in situ, then we know that they are observing the children's play, and their task is to develop a response to that which is educational, that they draw upon their knowledge that she has in order to choose a particular activity or choose a particular resource that's going to support that child's learning further. In those terms, the early years foundation stage provides support, and the development matters guidance offers these 2 columns of information on what they may be observing and how to actually support the child when they do observe a particular behaviour. If you're using Birth to 5 Matters, the alternative non-statutory guidance produced by the sector, they actually take it one stage further, and they don't just define the observations and then what adults might do, but also how they might seed the environment, how the resources may be put in front of the child to encourage their learning further. The problem with this is the overload. In terms of development matters, the latest version has 232 separate observations. That's just for 3-4-year-olds. In terms of Birth to 5 Matters, there's even more, even though they've cut up the sectors, the age bands. There are 348 for that age range. So where does that leave the practitioner? They see Liam is playing with some wooden figures. They have to think about what Liam knows and can do and what they can do in response to that, but they've got 365 or 595 if you take the number across all of the age ranges, across 7 areas of learning. They've got to decide which is the most relevant in terms of observations, and then they have to think about what the guidance says that they do on the basis of all those different possible options. Unsurprisingly, that has resulted in tick lists in the past, and it's very much likely to cause difficulty in the future. And the reason for that is because it's actually asking too much of the practitioner to remember all those different observations and the responses to them. The guidance is unworkable in that case. If you look at all the documents involved, if you don't look at the total observation items included in Development Matters 2012, it was 463. In the 2020 version, Granny has reduced them down by 20%. He says, well, it's 365 now, I make it. And Birth to 5 Matters actually has more than that. It's 595 different statements. In terms of the specific 22 to 60 months observation items, that's 306 down to 232 or 348 for a slightly different age band. Decision making, generally with adults, we know that our short-term working memory has severe limits. We can only consider between 5 and 7 options simultaneously. So we've got to draw upon these very, very large number of items and choose the 5 or 7 most appropriate. That's the problematic. That's the challenge for practice in applying this guidance. I think the practitioner would need to simultaneously and in the moment, I think, consider the prior knowledge and understanding of the child as it relates to every potential effective pedagogic activity. And then they would have to provide the support towards the achievement of each of those 17 learning goals, and then make a decision as to which the child is most likely to positively respond to, and at the same time provide a broad and balanced curriculum experience. You know, that's asking an awful lot, especially when you think that there's a lot of other children around and lots of distractions in the typical preschool. But in a nutshell, that's what practitioners are being asked to do. SchemaPlay automizes this. We're presenting chunks of the pedagogic knowledge that's demanded by the practitioner instead, and I'm going to explain how that works. The columns that they're providing Development Matters are explained as pathways to help you assess each child's development. in order to make informed decisions about what a child needs to learn and to be able to do next. But the actual items vary enormously in the detail that's provided. For example, one of them says understand why questions, like why do you think the caterpillar got so far? Develop their phenomenological awareness so that they can spot and suggest rhymes, so that they can count or slap syllables in a word, recognise words with the same initial sound, such as money and mother. Another one says extend and create ABAB patterns, like stick, leaf. These are not observations that are just going to jump out at a practitioner when their child is in free flow play. And inevitably, I think they're going to encourage practitioners to test children and to be referring back to the list. And tick list may still end up being used. Just so that you can see that this is also the case in Birth to 5 matters. I'll take a couple of examples from there. I've just taken them completely randomly, but 36 to 48 months includes beginning to understand why and how questions. 24 to 36 months fills in the missing word or phrase in a known rhyme, story or game. Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall. Oh, I did it. Begins to recognise familiar logos from children's popular culture, commercial print or icon straps. 24 to 36 again explores differences in size, length, weight and capacity. These are the observations of what a child might be doing that are intended to prompt particular adult actions or the provision of seeding of resources. It's memory overload we're talking about. Now, we know quite a lot about memory from research, and there are 4 strategies that are particularly stressed. Rehearsal is what we gain from expert experience, and ideally we'd have a situation where practitioners all had 15 to 20 years experience behind them, so that they knew what a typical child is, but also the different kinds of child that they're faced with in a particular observation, and they can draw upon their previous experience of the child, but also the kinds of activities they've responded to and how they've responded to make those decisions. That's rehearsal in practice, but of course we're not in that situation, unfortunately. The other part of the rehearsal for the experts develop is that understanding, and as the research shows, pedagogic content knowledge, which is the subject knowledge broken down to actually identify the progression within it, and actually detailed understanding of the different areas of learning are important, and also understanding child development in some depth. Sadly, even after a 3-year education course, students do not have the benefit of expert experience in this. So, it's a tall order, all of that being delivered from novices. Another strategy that's commonly used in terms of memory support is to use mnemonics. You will probably remember Richard of York gave Battle in Vain, which identifies the colours of the rainbow. There are shortcuts. There are ways of simplifying the memory challenge. Chunking is the one we use most naturally. And it's a simple idea. I mean, a telephone number is a chunk. We would never remember these discrete numbers, but you remember your telephone number. I remember my telephone number and can reel it off very quickly because it's chunked together. So I haven't learned the separate numbers. I've learned the whole song of it, if you like. Give you an example. Here's some letters. To actually recall those, to be able to recall those later, would be extremely difficult. But if we can make some sense of them, if we can break them up into things that are meaningful, so these are the same letters but backwards, cat, ABC, IBM, then that makes the memorization an awful lot easier, and we can make it even simpler if we put them into categories. So we've got animals, companies, alphabets, and probably we've all done this when we've been swatting for exams in the past, and getting into recall things that you have to remember to pass your exams. But cognitive overload cognitive load and cognitive overload is something that's been studied in depth, and that's picked up in the Ofsted research. And one of the most celebrated educational researchers in the UK in the last century was Dylan Wiliam, and he, for example, says, I've come to the conclusion that this particular theory and evidence is the single most important thing for researchers to know. Heavy praise. I give an example of it from early childhood education. If you think about how a child forms letters to begin with, they develop, as you know from our training in SchemaPlay, they develop through schemes of rotation and trajectory, being able to draw lines, and of course a rotation scheme allows you to do a part rotation scheme, and as they put them together, then they are able, that is a chunk, that is a complex operation that they've created from the combination of the vertical trajectory and the rotation. So chunking is already a big part of our training materials. I'm going to expand upon that a bit more today. Now I want to focus for a moment on the research, considerable research that's been done on the game of chess, because in some ways it's analogous. John and Susan Sweller take an ecological perspective when they make this statement, when they invite us to consider the difference between what two people will see if they walk into an office, depending upon whether the person is familiar with offices or has, for example, grown up in a forest. Looking at this board, I can see I have something in common with the forest dweller. It doesn't actually speak to me very much at all. What a chess grandmaster sees when she looks at the chessboard configuration is quite different to what a less able player sees. Typically, grandmasters have been identified as having 50 to 100,000 of these board configurations available to them. That's why they're grandmasters. And the perceptual differences are due to the difference in the content of their long-term memory. So it's actually acquiring that knowledge that's really significant. I'll introduce you to some of the experimental evidence on that. One of the studies asks you to reconstruct the board after 5 seconds, and it tested experts and grandmasters and novices in that case. So what you have to do, if I'm going to show you another board, what you have to do is to remember where all the pieces are, and then after 5 seconds you put them back into place. Yeah. So what do you think? Did you get them? Apparently a master player can actually get back 81% of all the pieces in the right places. A class A player can do 49. A good beginner can do 33. So you get the idea. You memorize the configuration, and then you've got a chunk of positions or moves associated with it. That's what makes you a grandmaster. Now, I'm not a very good player, and I've probably left it a bit late in life to learn the 50,000 or so board configurations that I would need in order to be a good player. But for those of you who are devotees of the game, here's a chunk from the Caro-Can defense. And note that it was downloaded from the Chunky Rook blog. And you know, clearly we're not the only people who are using this particular terminology. So the skilled practitioner has all these chunks. They've committed them to long-term memory, and their only task is to access the 5 to 7 closest matching configurations and then make a choice between them. For the novice like me, we have to work out the implications of every single move. If we apply that to our practitioner, then an expert practitioner is also going to have a vast repertoire of these different moves that are available to them. as SchemaPlay puts it, we have Liam being identified as using a positioning scheme, and as far as Shirley is concerned, Liam's teacher, her identification of his positioning provides the affordance for her to use SchemaPlay pedagogy. She thinks, I can see he's using positioning, so I can then see if he enjoys sorting them into colours as well. It's going to build directly upon what he's already seen to be doing effectively. She's building on what he can do and what he knows, and is likely to be very successful because of that. Or she might, for example, subsequently or instead of that, invite him to use grading peg dolls instead to actually develop even further. And she will address him and say, Liam, I've seen that you really like to position things. Would you like to play with this? A demonstration, and she's going to move his practice forward. No cognitive overload there. So this is the SchemaPlay model that we've identified in the training, and we know that the pedagogic subject knowledge that practitioner draws upon when they develop a focused activity with the child, or even when they're seeding the play environment for the child, is significant. We use the ideas book obviously to support practitioners in that, but again, the greater practice they have with children, they're going to develop that even further. The pedagogic subject knowledge is significant, and we need to address that in training as well. But another key area which is addressed in the research is, of course, this interaction between the practitioner and the child, and that's where sustained shared thinking actually happens. It's not necessarily verbal. It can be a non-verbal interaction, but it really is a meeting of minds. It's the adult actually recognizing what the child is actually thinking, what schemes they're using, and responding to that progressively to develop the child's thinking further. In terms of definitions, the formal definition of sustained shared thinking is about contributing to thinking. Sometimes it's approached or identified as something to do with verbal language, but that isn't the case, and we make it quite clear of that in our writing. It's an active construction of shared perspective, or perception, if you like. It's a meeting of minds. The other thing worth mentioning at this point, I think, is how the characteristics of early learning tell us that when each of those conditions of characteristics is satisfied, children are learning. So the question we need to be asking ourselves all the time is, do we see them actively engaged? Do we see them self-motivated to play and explore? Do we see them doing their own thinking? Because if they're doing that, then the chances are they're learning. As Nancy Stewart, who the architect of the characteristics, put it, how am I providing the interaction that supports these? That's positive relationships, and what opportunities have I given to support these? What enabling environments have I provided? SchemaPlay provides just that, a model that helps us ensure that each of those actually happens in practice. And the child is learning because they're in place. The characteristics tell us what the children are learning when all those things are satisfied. The problem is, of course, that there are problems, barriers and obstacles to that every single day. There may be too many scheduled activities in the day or interruptions. There may be too few physical and environmental resources available. There could be too many as well. That can also get in the way of learning and development. Poor child access to the resources, but also things like child deprivation, their ill health, for example. A weak understanding of child development and learning can get in the way of it. But even bad weather or the clothing being inappropriate for the child can actually provide an obstacle to the characteristics of effective learning actually taking place. A lack of interest, motivation, laziness, distractions, all of us have these things at some point, children and adults. And of course, there's safety issues as well. The thing to remember, I think, is that there are always problems, barriers, and obstacles. Our task is to be aware of them and actually dismantle them as far as possible on a day-to-day basis, a minute-by-minute basis, as we come across them. In the audit for SchemaPlay, we provide a particular list that will be the obstacles, barriers to SchemaPlay. So we identify the amount of free flow playtime that's available to the child as a key factor to be considered and to be maximised. We monitor and audit the resources that encourage schemes in the settings. We encourage the use of the ZPDF model so that practitioners are actually talking to each other and to parents about the actual process. Encourage children to see themselves as learners. We very much promote independent snack and the educational benefits of that. SchemaPlay storybooks that reinforce the schemes. Attention to feeling states, which supports children's development of theory of mind, and that has consequences across the curriculum. Role changes in socio-dramatic play for the same reason. The use of textured and traceable numbers, we're supporting an embodied perspective on cognitive development. So the embodiment of the schemes is crucially important. Also community and parent engagement, and schemes in the home learning environment. The home learning environment is the key place where child development and learning is maximised. All the research shows that its effects are much greater than the pedagogy of the setting, and in the most effective settings in all research studies there is home extension and engagement, which may account for a lot of their effectiveness. Now we're going to introduce you to another tool now, which we haven't used in our training before, the SchemaPlay curriculum wheel. And this is what it looks like. You recognise the schemes that dominate the central circles. These are displayed here in a hierarchical order to emphasise the progressively more complex and combined nature of the schemes that are being employed together when the children are engaged in exchanging, grouping, sequencing, ordering, grading and designing. The blue and the red bands have also been included that reflect the early years foundation stage curriculum arrangement. So I'm going to hand you over to Lynette now, who will explain how it can actually be used in practice.